Today we begin the new winter quarter. This winter quarter will cover the months of December, January, and February. Our topic for this new winter quarter is justice, law, and history. And during this quarter, we're going to be focusing on justice as presented in the Old Testament under the law. And we're also going to be looking at some of the circumstances that construed God's people's thoughts on justice. Today we begin unit number 1 entitled God Requires Justice. And in these 4 lessons for the month of December, we will look at how God asks for his leaders of his people to rely on his law to administer justice. Our lesson for today, for December the 5th, 2021, is lesson number 1, entitled The Protection of Justice. Our printed passage today is Deuteronomy chapter 5, the B part of verse number 1 through verse number 3, the 10th chapter, verse number 12, verse number 13, and the 27th chapter, verse 1 through 10. As we think about our lesson today, the book of Deuteronomy, with the word Deuteronomy meaning the sayings of, the book of Deuteronomy is the sayings of Moses. And it is literally Moses' last recorded sermon as the children of Israel sat on the banks of Moab, looking across Jordan's river into the promised land of Canaan. And although Moses was not able to go with them into the promised land, he wanted to send them with something. And the entire book of Deuteronomy is the words of this last sermon that he gave. And do not be surprised to find out that the majority of this sermon, Moses is reminding the people of the commandments of God. For this last sermon, Moses is telling them to hear the commandments of God, learn them, keep them, and do them. That's what he reminds them, reminding them of the commandments of God. And to put such an emphasis on it, he tells them, when you get into the promised land, I want you to put them on these standing stones of remembrance, so that whenever you come across them, you'll remember the commandments of God. And this is why, because verse number 13 in that 10th chapter says that it is for your good. One thing Moses knew, that as the people of God were moving into this promised land, this land of Canaan, that they would come across some different religions and those who worship different gods than the God Jehovah, the God of Yahweh, the God I am that I am. And Moses knew that it was a fear and a threat, because the children of Israel would get into the promised land and they would start to follow after these idols and worship these strange gods. So Moses had to tell them, fear the Lord, walk in his ways, and love him and serve him with all of your heart and with all of your soul. And do not go after all of these idols. Well, we all know the end of this story, because Israel would go into the promised land, not keep the commandments of God, and they would bring upon themselves God's judgment, all the way down to the point that God used the enemy of the Babylonians and the Syrians to come in and to drive the people of God away into captivity. And because they did not keep the commandments of God, they found themselves not having good, but having bad. Now, let's relate that to us today, because God still calls for us to obey him. And he still speaks to us concerning some of the things he wants us to do and that he wants us not to do. So what happens is that the word of God and his commandments of what we can do or can't do become a parameter for us. And that parameter protects us. It protects us from facing hurt, harm, facing that which is bad, facing that which is evil. The word of God becomes parameter. His commandments keep us safe from falling away and from hurt and disaster, and it even keeps us away from death. And so I want to leave us with this thought today as we think about the commandments of God and obeying them. Let us all be wise to not just hear the word of God, but let's be wise in listening and obeying, so that we too can not only hear and learn, but we can keep and do the commandments of God. And if we do those commandments of God, then we will be able to enjoy the promised land that he has given to us. I pray today that we all can feel the pulling of God, that we would give him all of our heart, all of our soul, and all of our mind.